Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Looks like we have a good crowd today, and I still see a few people joining in. And my name is Philip Casisa. I am the Director of Product Management here at Focal Point Data Risk. And we have a great webinar here for you today. I know everyone has a lot on their minds right now and a lot on their plates. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. Our team has made a great presentation that we think will find very useful as you're preparing your SOC to operate in these really uncertain times. So we'll be getting started here shortly. I wanted to bring your attention to a few things. First of all, you should have a GoToWebinar dashboard on the side of your screen. You can use that to ask questions throughout the webinar. Just drop them into the questions section, and we'll get to those, and we'll have Gary answer them for you at the end of this scenario, at the end of the presentation today. We should be running about 30 minutes, and that would leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, give or take. We'll try our best to get to every question, but if there are some that we don't get to, certainly we could take some of those offline, especially if you want to talk about something specific to your SOC. We're happy to have those discussions and take them as far as you'd like to go. Before we get started, I just wanted to introduce our speaker for the afternoon, one of the leading experts in SOC and security operations, Gary McIntyre. So Gary is a director with Focal Point Cyber Defense Group. He has 19 years of experience in security operations. He's been doing this longer than I've even been able to spell CISSP. So it's been a privilege to have him here on staff and to have him prepare something for you all today specific to the topic at hand. So he's been pretty much everywhere, but primarily he's worked most recently at Cisco, where he helped develop SOCs for its customers and led a number of security initiatives across the globe, really. He also literally wrote the book on SOC design, co-authoring a book called Security Operations Center, Building, Operating, and Maintaining Your SOC while he was there at Cisco. So I'd like to thank him for speaking to us today. One other bit of housekeeping before we get underway. I know we have some folks that are on their first Focal Point webinar today, so I'd like to introduce briefly who we are. Focal Point Data Risk is a leading cybersecurity services provider working with Fortune 500 and governments and government organizations. We integrate market-leading consulting, technology integration, and cyber workforce development services. Really just trying to future-proof your organizations against threats and all the types of data, laws that are changing, workforce shortages, you name it. In cyber, we pretty much address it. So you can find out more about us on our website. So www.focal-point.com. Happy to talk to you guys after the presentation today. Hopefully we have some great stuff for you. Please remember, get your questions into the box and we will make sure that we get answered. And right after that, you'll see me again after that. For right now, I will turn it over to Gary. Gary, take it away.
Awesome, thanks, Phil. So obviously we're living in the midst of a gigantic crisis at this moment. And when you think about it, crises happen, right? Sometimes they're local, meaning that they might be specific to an individual location or to a particular organization, but sometimes they are global in nature and can affect pretty well every organization out there. What's interesting, though, is that in general, security operations is always living in crisis, either spending most of their time preparing for crisis or dealing with crisis. And what really separates sort of the good organizations from the great ones is how they really manage those crises and if they are able to manage the crisis well. And one of the things that sort of came out some years ago was basically a short paper back in 2013 that sort of highlighted let's say, the key tasks of good crisis management. And in general, if you sort of take a look at these tasks, really from an executive perspective, this is what they would have to be able to accomplish in order to be able to manage a crisis well. And security operations centers tend to sort of help support this in a variety of ways. So executives, first of all, have to have early recognition that, let's say, a crisis is even occurring. And being able to get some early warning, even on the basis of faint signals, is usually a result of having folks that are within the organization that have a lot of experience seeing those sorts of crises before they actually come to pass. So that's usually going to be the first key part. The second part is to be able to make sense of what is often very incomplete or ambiguous or uncertain data, to be able to figure out really what's going on and to be able to use that limited data source to still provide some sense of what's actually happening and provide that as input into critical decisions. One of the most interesting things that I'm sure all of you are experiencing at the moment around trying to make decisions, even day to day about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, is that the higher the amount of uncertainty, the harder it is to make decisions. And particularly if you're working for organizations that are attempting to make these decisions in the public eye, it can be extremely difficult for those officials or people in points of control to be able to actually justify the decisions that they're making with such limited information sources. So our job usually is to provide some better data to help support those decisions. A good part of what executives also have to do is to really improve coordination, whereas in sort of normal day-to-day business or normal organizational rhythm, you might have a lot of silos within the business. You might also have a lot of silos between yourselves and other organizations. But ultimately, these ultimately have to be coordinated well and orchestrated well during a crisis so that you're able to break down some of these sort of natural barriers between both parts of the business or organization, as well as, let's say, with suppliers. But crises also have a tendency of breaking things that have actually been working perfectly fine under normal operations. And so be able to recouple those things back together where you're relying upon, let's say, critical vendors and their supply chains in order to be able to deliver for your business, or where you actually have to intentionally decouple portions of your organization in order to contain portions of the crisis. This is also a key part of what makes good crisis management. Ultimately, though, people are also relying upon the executives to be able to provide clear meaning as to what's really going on during the crisis, to provide some clear idea of what's happening, what their perspective is, what decisions they're made, and what advice they would give on the path to go forward. And to be able to communicate that effectively is obviously going to be extremely important. The more direct and clear that communication can be, obviously the more effective that the crisis can be managed by the executive. But ultimately, they also have to be able to take accountability and absorb accountability where need be, not only for the decisions that they have to make, but for the preparations that they've done to prepare for this moment and to bring the organization out of a crisis into a place that hopefully is stronger than it was before. To be able to learn from the experiences that they've had through the crisis and to be able to then enhance the resilience of the organization to be able to handle a similar sort of crisis in future. Now, under most circumstances, security operations teams are in a great position to use their everyday skills to help. And what I mean by everyday skills is, if you think about sort of what a SOC does, or a cyber defense center, or a cybersecurity center, or its various equivalents, a lot of what they do is taking early alerts, taking limited data, and to be able to then turn around and be able to provide reasonable advice to executives. So there's a number of different ways that we can help. We can provide some early alerting in some cases to maybe problems that are occurring. So at the current crisis, this might include, for example, new threats that are taking advantage of COVID-19 alerts with a tendency for people to click on them. To be able to, for example, provide some information as to, let's say, some areas of partners that may have been compromised, or where things, for example, may not be working as intended within the organization. But also, frankly, we are used to working with a high degree of uncertainty. And what I really mean by that is oftentimes we're expected to sort of figure out what bad things are going on when we really don't have all the data. And so we usually have developed within our teams, even fairly small SOC teams, a really keen eye for understanding limited data and to be able to still come out of that with a reasonable level of confidence as a go forward. And to be able to communicate that level of confidence at any moment in time is a key part about what most really great SOCs are able to do. And they are then able to provide advice to decision makers. What's really interesting about this is that in many cases, most SOCs, especially smaller ones, have often recruited people from, let's say, within their most advanced technical support or service desk type roles, or within other parts of the IT or business organizations. And so we often have a lot of context for how the business in fact operates. So our ability to provide advice under uncertainty is not just about the security threats that we may be experiencing, but may in fact be a set of skills that ends up getting stretched back into our old lives, into our old sort of knowledge that we have within the rest of the organization. But to be able to also coordinate across boundaries is a natural part about what almost every SOC has to do. Whenever we experience a major threat or even a minor threat, we often have to involve multiple different levels of owners and custodians and various different partners and suppliers in order to be able to coordinate a response. So our ability to leverage that same coordinative orchestrating capability is also going to be valuable to the organization. We're also there to help keep the lights on. So to help make sure that as we, for example, have to look at either contracting certain parts of the organization or expanding certain parts of the organization, that we're able to watch out for key signs that is maybe compromising some of the resilience of the organization and helping them keep the lights on by looking for potential threats to the day-to-day safe and steady operation of the environment. But ultimately, we're also there to help those executives build confidence in their understanding about how the effects of the crisis is really having in the organization. And our ability to help them build that confidence is going to be absolutely critical at this sort of stage. But also helping them communicate and maintaining the lines of both communication and collaboration is going to be extremely important, especially as a lot of workforces have moved to, let's say, an entirely remote operation, where before we might have had, let's say, multinational operations in different countries, all forced to sort of work, let's say, remote to each other. We're now getting down to where individuals are being forced essentially to work individually, remotely from each other. So making sure that the appropriate communications and collaborations are working effectively is going to be important. But also where we're able to take accountability for a portion of the protection of the environment to help allow the executive to focus on other parts of the business or other areas that are going to need their keener focus, to be able to essentially take on the larger security mission and to be able to provide larger parts of that mission while the rest of the organization is distracted by other things that the organization needs to deal with. But also then providing some context to the learning that we are going to learn as we get through a crisis, as we learn more, and to really understand how we can, in fact, then improve and make the organization get stronger. But what happens if security operations itself is in crisis? And this is what I think a lot of us are experiencing right now, and certainly a lot of the folks I've been talking to over the last couple of weeks are experiencing, where it is not just the organization that's in crisis, either because they've received some sort of security threat that's active inside the environment, or because, for example, they've had a particular site issue, but where the actual security operation itself and the way that it's actually been operating is in fact in crisis. There are a lot of potential ways that security operations itself can be fragile. And what I mean by this is that if you put something under pressure, you sort of have two different options of how it's going to go. It's either going to break because it's fragile, or it's going to get stronger because it's not. And where a good author by the name of Nicholas Taleb referred to something called antifragility is that ability sometimes to get, in fact, stronger as you put them under pressure. What's interesting about a lot of SOC teams, especially the ones that are great SOC teams, is that they tend to be anti-fragile. They've built a really strong team ability to be able to survive under a great deal of pressure to be able to deliver to the organization. But as you separate them and as they get tired, obviously they become more fragile over time. So you have to start looking at sort of what I consider to be the sort of three key areas of weakness, where if you're looking at your own security operations team, where you have to sort of start focusing some of your effort. The first area is obviously going to be stress and attrition. Part of that is going to be as a crisis goes on for a longer period of time, or as the workload shifts and changes, this can put a lot of additional stress, particularly because the expectations may not have changed as to what the SOC team needs to be delivering. So part of it's going to be around the stress. But also, frankly, we have a lot of organizations we're working with right now that are also experiencing high degrees of attrition, where their own SOC teams or security teams, as well as others, are all essentially, being downsized in some fashion, forcing a lot fewer people, I should say, to do a lot more work. So when it comes to the stress and attrition, a lot of more successful teams depend on really a small number of key individuals. And this is often a really big strength, where you recognize that you have a few individuals that are just simply awesome, and they make the SOC team so much more awesome. And they bring a lot of sort of unique qualities that really make that SecOps work. Maybe they're the sort of person that helps their colleagues really understand data. Maybe they're the ones that help bring together better collaboration within the team to improve on decision making. Maybe they're the sort of person that helps people calm down during a crisis and provide that sort of calm level head. But how those individuals respond to stress, and especially increasing or consistently high stress, can often mean that who you have hired and how the person you've been working with side by side for this maybe a long period of time, maybe for years, is no longer going to be quite that same person. As they get distracted by home stress, or as they are dealing with things outside the environment or within the environment, they are obviously going to be dealing with that stress in different ways. Losing key people obviously can deepen any crisis. And so losing them either through attrition or by losing them through simply excessive amounts of stress is going to be an extremely important thing to keep an eye out for. The second thing to keep an eye out for is any sort of process breakdowns. Processes are really often not designed and implemented to work well during a crisis. And particularly if you've designed your processes to be very mature, meaning performed in a really consistent, rigorous sort of way, usually done inside of a SOC so that you can maintain a certain degree of consistency with your metrics and the services you provide. The challenge is that managing crisis means that you often have to be very flexible. You have to be willing to turn around and take those same processes that up to that point have been extremely mature and identify the ones that you can afford to make more relaxed and to be more flexible, or to change the way those processes work to require less steps or less formal decision making. So any sort of dependence on a rigid, broken, or ineffective process can simply make a crisis worse. Because, for example, it might paralyze decision making in such a way, for example, if key decision makers are no longer available to make decisions that are rigidly defined in a process, or where a process can only be done in a defined sort of way, a lot of people will tend to not be able to do a more flexible set of options if you don't start providing them with that flexibility. On the technology side, we also have a lot of dependencies inside of a SOC. And in general, if you think of a SOC, we often think of the sort of core technology stack around things for like our security information and event management systems, or our case management systems, or SOAR, or our threat intelligence platform, maybe the ticketing system. We sort of rely upon each of these sort of being, let's say, stable. But we also indirectly also expect the rest of technology operations to also be stable. So that includes everything from the implemented controls through the systems that we use to monitor them, through all of our communications and collaboration tools. So any sort of unexpected changes or failures can be a big problem for us. And in general, this is going to become a larger problem depending on the nature of the crisis. But also, for the longer that a crisis goes on, the more likely that unexpected changes and failures will occur. We've already had a lot of changes in the last few weeks, especially as organizations have really pursued heavy remote access, much heavier than they did before. We now have to deal with the impacts of those changes as we've essentially expanded our potential threat footprint much wider than outside of our standard enterprises. And where, for example, in the retail world, where large numbers of organizations have shut down, or the restaurateur world, for example, same sort of thing, we're also having to deal with essentially open IT systems existing physically in these spaces that might still be problems for us going forward. So ultimately, any sort of unexpected changes or failures can also be a big problem. Now, ideally, of course, we would have dealt with all these problems far in advance. We would have had perfect plans of all the pandemics. But for all the pandemic planning that even maybe some of you have done in the past, we probably weren't prepared for everything that we're now experiencing or would experience during any sort of crisis. But there are a number of things that you can do to sort of help your security operations team and help yourself deliver effectively out of it. The first thing, obviously, is to focus on your people and to look for the signs of that stress that you should be looking for within your teams. Removing unnecessary friction in the way they work, but also, frankly, focusing the type of work that they're doing on those things that are most important. One of the things that's probably going to be most important is to make sure that it's clear how decisions get made when normal decision makers are not available, and make it so that teams are fully aware of what missions are most important to execute and what, in fact, are their priorities for this period of time, and give them the power and responsibility and capability to be able to do it. And ideally, you also have to make sure that you're not overly relying upon those key individuals that you've really relied upon in the past, without giving them some significant breaks so that you're able to sort of leverage them effectively over a longer period of time. But that goes to the second point, which is to broaden essentially the base of your operations. One of the things that a lot of organizations have in place and have had in place for many years within a SOC space would be things like incident response retainers and similar relationships with various vendors. It's going to be very important for you to be able to broaden your base of operations support, mainly because you are not only going to have your own level of attrition associated with stress inside of the SOC, but also as the business needs that knowledge and experience that you might have in the SOC more, let's say, globally within the organization, you might be losing people essentially to the rest of the business, which means that you have to rely more heavily upon others to assist you. As much as possible, broadening your base should also include any sort of automation or simplification that you can go through. Now, those would be two slightly different things. The automation obviously would help drive out anything that can be done automatically without having human beings really spending too much time to evaluate it. Obviously, over the last few years, most SOCs have been focusing on automating at least a portion of the plays that they're running, but this is now going to become a higher priority. The second part, simplification, is really looking at what you're in fact looking at or how you are triaging issues into the SOC to decide ultimately which ones will be most important and which things, frankly, should either be suppressed through heavier prevention or where, in fact, you can actually simply ignore them for now. This can obviously be a little dangerous, but it's going to be important for you to be able to focus your team's effort and your available resources as much as possible on what's most important. You also need to be able to manage the stress and the uncertainty. As I said, not everybody deals with stress and uncertainty in the same ways, and people tend to be a little different under stress and uncertainty than they maybe were before. This not only includes people inside of the SOC, but also include your stakeholders and consumers. Part of what you have to do is to be able to give them the confidence that you have the mission in hand and to be able to deliver a confident mission as much as you can to the organization. That helps then manage some of the expectations that your consumers may have of your services, but also helps you keep your team focused and on track. On the fourth point, you really have to focus on communicating and collaboration much more heavily. Inside of a normal, let's say, sort of SOC space, even ones that are, let's say, more modern and set up in a fairly collaborative sort of setting, we still have situations where people tend to work fairly well alone, while also having the ability to collaborate well together as they need to. That level of collaboration will become much more important, mainly because you need to use the entire team to look for signs of stress and to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to get help and support from their peers. This is an opportunity for you to improve not only the strength of your team, but also improve essentially your relationship also with the consumers that you're going to be collaborating with. And finally, as we get through some of the worst parts of our current crisis, or as you get through the worst parts of any crisis, you have to already start preparing for the next one. So just because you've managed to make it through the crisis does not mean that you should necessarily relax. This is a great opportunity to learn from what we've done during this crisis or through any crisis and to be able to essentially improve on it. I'm hoping that this sort of gives you some hints as to what we're seeing a lot from a lot of organizations around the world, both within public and private sector. And I think at this point, I will actually open up the floor and see if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask.
Hey, Gary, I'm back. Let me pull up the questions that we have so far.
Now, while Phil's doing that, one of the things I do want to say is that as each of you might also have things that you don't want to share in a public forum like this, more than willing to have a private conversation with you where you want to bring something up or just get some advice. One of the things about broadening your base, as I call it, is that reaching out to folks like us that are perfectly willing to help as you're going through this latest set of crises. Anyway, Phil, back over to you.
So the first question I have is, one, I run a really small operations team. I'm particularly worried that I'm going to lose what little staff I have. What can I do?
Probably the most important thing to do is to, first of all, manage the expectations. If you're running a really small team, it means that you are able to do a lot of things with probably a good team of generalists, right? A good group of people that are able to understand the organization or able to deliver a good set of mission, can do a lot of different things within the SOC. That's a really positive thing, and that you're able to work with less people and probably still deliver the mission. But you also need to make it very clear to your organization how you will be impacted by having less resources. You'll also probably going to have to pull on retainer-based relationships as quickly as possible to make sure that as you might get a serious incident, that you're able to pull on it most easily. If you don't already have an IR retainer, for example, in place, or have good relationships with your threat intelligence providers or anti-malware providers, this is the time to make sure that all of that is ready and set up, and that everybody knows how to use it well.
Excellent. So I have another one here. So there's been a lot of process changes made on the fly. So for those organizations that haven't had the remote access as extensive as required for the crisis that we're in now, some of them have chosen continuity or even flexibility over security. So there's been compromises. When is the right time to revisit and reevaluate, considering that the timeline is sort of changing? Like, we thought this was maybe 2 weeks, now it's 4 weeks, maybe it's 6 weeks. So there's still a lot of uncertainty there. So how would you handle that?
Yeah, this is a huge one. I mean, a lot of organizations have gone from having, let's say, a fairly limited but contained sort of remote access sort of footprint to being basically distributed. We've now moved to an almost completely distributed set of enterprises, distributed down to the individual person. Obviously, myself and Phil and others working from our individual homes today. This is going to put a lot of pressure on the infrastructure, but as you say, it also puts a lot of pressure on the security controls we had up in place. In many cases, we've had to compromise on the level of authentication that we're really offering, or even using platforms that inherently are inherently less secure just to keep the business going. What probably is going to be most important is to start looking sooner rather than later as to what the sort of quick deployment options are for things like multi-factor authentication. Since contrary to the last pandemic I was involved in, there are a lot better options nowadays to spin up multi-factor authentication much more quickly, particularly if you already leverage things like, for example, Microsoft Azure, which one customer that I'm helping with right now has done. It's relatively simple to spin up multi-factor authentication, even if there is still some work to be done. Obviously, the larger the organization is, the more help you're going to need to get to basically make that work effectively. And that's where folks like ourselves can be really handy, since we do a lot of identity and access management work. But the biggest thing is to sort of recognize that at least for now, the processes will have to be relaxed. And to go back to the business when you think it's appropriate to start saying, maybe this is time for us to start making sure that we're actually starting to deal with some of the threats that we're experiencing here. But also, frankly, using the data that you're getting out of those endpoints that you've now essentially distributed to the world, and to be able to start building a good set of data to explain why certain processes should be stronger, or why, for example, multi-factor authentication should be deployed. So leveraging more heavily things like penetration testing, social engineering testing, these are things that ultimately I think will be very helpful. One of the things that a customer of mine is doing, in fact, to sort of help is basically ensuring that every single home PC of all their employees is in fact given a free antivirus suite that connects back into the mothership so that they can actually monitor essentially what's going on inside their homes. Mainly because they've had to open up remote access even into BYOD equipment they were never expecting.
Yeah, and we've already heard that from people in the field as well, right? I mean, everyone's at home, kids are doing online schooling, and if you have a VPN, device backhauling all that traffic, all the Netflix, all the, Zoom conferencing.
One of the things we talked about for years and years is to sort of say, never split tunneling, right? Never. It should all be flowing into all the enterprise traffic should be flowing into the enterprise. Well, that's really off now. You really do need to be able to sort of split that out, but also, frankly, making sure that you're doing at least some basics around hygiene, helping your employees do the right things with their own home equipment, and doing the best you can under the circumstances, I think is going to be most important. But also, frankly, one of the other things that's come up is this sudden depressurization of our physical footprint. One of the things that we started talking about with customers, especially where they've essentially, let's say, shut down offices or retail locations, is how they can start to contract, meaning shrink down their actual footprint, making it so that ultimately these remote sites, essentially relatively unprotected physical sites, don't become a future problem for them. So starting to, for example, use empty retail stores essentially as gigantic occupancy sensors so that they're able to determine if somebody has inappropriately gotten into a store when in fact that store should be completely shut down.
Yeah.
So this is where you can start to think about this not only as a way that you have to close this off, but also the way to leverage this new world to be able to get some new telemetry and some new value you can provide to the organization that way.
Great. So I have a question that came in just now. So cyber attacks are on the rise. And I think we've even seen that in our own operations. Your advice to mitigate it while remote or while sort of handling crisis as well.
Yeah, a big thing that we've sort of done over the years is that we've been, let's say, less on the preventive side and more on the we'll watch but keep an eye out for the bad stuff sort of side, right? So we'll let a lot of stuff sort of go, but we'll do a little less prevention. Unfortunately, what's going to happen, I think, with a lot of the sort of attackers or adversaries taking advantage of the current situation is that they're going to be targeting vulnerable people at home using equipment that then become a backdoor into the environment or a backdoor through your partners into the environment. And again, keeping in mind that same sort of physical footprint. So a big thing that we're going to have to look at is just a great deal more prevention, a lot more restricted access into things inside the environment that they legitimately need access to, and a lot of more restricted access where they don't. Shutting down remote offices where they don't really need to be running, making sure, for example, especially that any sort of weak or inappropriate sort of wireless access has been disabled inside of remote locations. All this is going to be important to start allowing us to focus more heavily upon the remaining channels we have left. And obviously helping people have good hygiene within their home environments will also frankly help them as well. It's right. Probably the best place for us to focus.
Excellent. Last question I have. So I run SecOps in a number of places around the world. What are some tips you can share on how to keep those teams focused? Wow,
that is a big and difficult one. We have a number of customers we're working with that have essentially, like most folks, run a follow the sun model 24/7, meaning that they typically have operations centers deployed globally. And those operation centers take on that global footprint at certain portions during the day, or where they've used various different countries to deliver, let's say, a 24/7 mission, but have relied upon those people being able to physically go into a specific space in which to do it. It can be extremely difficult, for example, at this point, to suddenly change that model in some countries where the basic supply chain to obtain, let's say, home computing and internet access is simply not as available as it is in other countries. So part of what you have to look at is essentially trying your best to enable those teams to operate effectively, improving a lot of the collaboration between those teams as much as you can. And that can often mean doing a lot more 24/7 work from countries that are at any particular point in time experiencing less of the crisis than others. So at the moment, for example, you might find that certain of your centers are able to basically do more of the work. You're going to have to rely upon them to do more of the work. As you are shifting or changing, or in some cases retooling one country, you might have to be relying much more heavily upon another. It does mean that at least for now, some of that sort of 24/7, always eyes on glass sort of approach to SOCs that many organizations have used may have to be compromised at least in some fashion as you're trying to basically do your best with the resources you have. At least thankfully for the moment, this particular pandemic crisis is hitting countries unevenly, meaning that we have certain countries that are able to continue to deliver services a little bit more effectively, and you have others that are not. But it's going to be most important to take advantage of wherever the resources are and to be able to use them effectively. Part of that is happening with some customers is that they're seriously delegating the decision-making power to these remote locations. So they're able to take independent action. In many cases, they've relied upon being able to go back to the mothership and sort of saying, hey, we need your advice on what to do, or here's what we found, you got to decide what to do about it. A lot of that means that you have to distribute not just the responsibility to deal with security incidents, but also the power to deal with them.
That's fascinating. I mean, having worked in on the smaller team side, especially in Florida, I always thought that I understood what crisis management might look like, considering we have hurricane season every year, and there's at least 3
Yep.
or 4 near misses year in and year out, and then the occasional, impact that could be here, could be 100 miles from us, and you have maybe 24 hours notice as to which one it's going to be. So
Yep.
understanding how to do it in this sort of crisis where the crisis is global. And so even if your plans included, you know, distributed decision making, continuity of operations, follow the sun. So even if you had all those things into account, what happens when the whole world uh, is affected almost simultaneously? So these
Well, a
are
lot
these
of
are
it
really
comes
the
down
tough things to
to,
wrestle with.
yeah, a lot of it comes down to engineering at this point, right? If you think of those sorts of organizations that have designed their infrastructure to last for, in some cases, decades, think of things like water distribution and generation, or sorry, power distribution generation, where a lot of their equipment has a field life of, let's say, 20 years. They've been engineered to be able to survive for longer periods of time. And in some ways, that's sort of what we have to be aware of. We have to take the parts of the organization that we can and make them as able to run automatically with less human intervention as possible. And to make it so that as much as possible, we're able to focus then the more limited human resources on those problems that simply cannot be solved through better automation or more resilient technology. And that's ultimately where I think we're going to be focusing here as we get through this crisis, but also as we get to the next one, is our ability to basically use the human resources more effectively at dealing with things that are really important for people to deal with, where uncertainty remains high, and trying to decrease as much uncertainty as we can and improving resilience generally to help deal with these sorts of incidents in future.
Well, that's all the questions we have. Looks like we're pretty close on time too. So I would
Right.
say that we're about wrapped up for today. So if you have a question that that you didn't want to share with us on in public, you want to talk to our experts about your SOC, feel free to reach out. You can reach us through the website, or you can drop us a line at the email address in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. That's info@focal-point.com. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. As a reminder, we'll be sending everyone a link to the recorded version. If not today, then probably by sometime tomorrow. Thank you, Gary, for coming on and sharing this excellent information with us. Hopefully you got something that your team can use that helps make your operations better. Again, if you have anything else, feel free to reach out to us and we will help you as best we can. Our team is working remotely, but fully functional at this point in time. Happy to help out. So
Indeed.
thank you and have a good day, everyone. Take care. Be safe.
Thanks very much. Stay safe.